Welcome to your very simplified brain. So, what is going on with stress and how does that actually affect the brain when it is kind of, doing its thing? What can we actually expect from stress when it hits the brain? First, let's talk about the fact that we have more than one brain working at a time, alright? And this is kind of, an understanding that we have evolved different clumps, almost like different continents of the world that is our mind, alright? So, everyone has, of course, their reptilian brain, that is, as it is titled, this is the spine, this is basically the back of the head here. This is where our base animal instincts are: fight, flight, eat, screw, all that kind of stuff right in here, okay? Up here we have the limbic system, also considered the mammalian brain, and this gives us our emotional intelligence. This is what gives us our ability to bond. This is what gives our ability to love, to form lasting connections, alright? And also how we can, further handle things like long-term memory, short-term memory, how we actually think and feel at the same time, as well as, what happens, it gives us more to work with in a stressful situation. The more brain you have going at a time, the more intelligent you are. So this is more evolved than this. We also have our prefrontal cortex, sometimes referred to as just the higher cortex. This is basically the brain that gives us our problem-solving abilities. This is more of our heightened intellectual capacity. This is the brain that is really making us smarter than the average bear, so to speak. This is the brain that allows us to solve complex, whether it's logical thinking or anything along those lines. We were kind of dealing with much more, where we're able to have a little bit more foresight. This is also where we have our ability to kind of predict outcomes. Now, the way stress hits the brain, when we talk about, behavioral and mental changes and things like that, a lot of what is getting stimulated is in the limbic system, okay, the mammalian brain. So it's the brain that's not quite up here, okay, it's not quite up here, it's right in the middle, alright? And most importantly to understand is that when certain parts of the brain are turned on and stimulated, other parts of the brain turn off, or often become impaired. And a good illustration of this, when it comes to mindfulness, are these three little sectors of the brain, which I did not bother to illustrate. They're in here, somewhere. Alright, we've got the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the insular cortex, sometimes just referred to as the insula. Now, the amygdala is what we normally associate with things like stress, anxiety, depression. Okay, all the emotions that go along with those things. It is stimulated by the stress hormone cortisol, and it is also responsive to adrenaline. The hippocampus, that's our memory center, and the insular cortex, this is where we can focus on things like concentration. Alright, where we actually have our sensory perception using the 5 senses. What happens when we get into a place where we go into dramatic fight or flight situation, kill or be killed, that kind of that kind of thing, our amygdala turns on and goes on full blast, right? But the hippocampus actually is impaired, alright? When people are highly stressed, highly anxious, the hippocampus goes down. This is why you have people who have very hectic lives or who have very hectic deadlines, people who don't get enough sleep, people who have a tendency to have a million things going on all the time, can't seem to ground themselves. They can't seem to keep a schedule. They can't seem to remember one day from the next. They have a hard time remembering simple things like birthdays, holidays, things along those lines. And they can also have a difficult time remembering commitments, things, maybe parts of a promise that they made, obligations that they have. It turns us into a very disorganized individual. When we have this going on, it's also important to understand that the more stimulated this area, the limbic system, becomes, the less active the prefrontal cortex is. So we have this shutting down. Not necessarily shutting down, but we have this kind of going down, and our focus is going more and more into our limbic system. Okay? This is where logic goes away, and this is where we think we're thinking with the heart. Okay? Because the limbic system does have a lot to do with when people say like, but my heart says this, they're really saying, but my limbic system says this. Okay? And so, you know, let's just say that we have a person who has been just a bad month, you know, and they haven't necessarily given themselves a break, taken the time to be mindful, retrain the brain. Guess what? They're losing contribution from this portion of the brain as time goes on. Okay, because remember, the brain is highly adaptive. So if the brain doesn't think it needs to be putting all of its focus here, all of its energy here, it's not going to. Now, as far as what the brain thinks, it doesn't know what's going on in your life. It can't tell the difference between whether or not you're stressed out at work, or you're having a fight with your boyfriend, or, you know, your wife is talking about wanting to move to another country. It can't tell the difference. Okay? So if it thinks that we can't be here, we need to be here, it's going to do that. And what happens is it starts to learn to train to release different kinds of chemicals for prolonged periods, which again form that adaptation. Now luckily these are very fluid, very clay-like organs, so we don't necessarily have to worry about this being permanent. When people say, I can't change, that's just who I am, that might actually be them just being discouraged about what it might take to change. Because when we look at this, if it can go down, it can go back up, all right? But what happens is that if our brain gets used to, reacting, releasing a certain amount of hormone for certain amounts of time, you know, then all of a sudden we have a situation where a person is sort of just kind of trained. It's almost like a reflex. But again, just like you have muscle memory in your arms and in your hands, you know, and you have to train your muscle memory. You know, you have to train your muscle memory when you're riding a bike, you have to train your muscle memory when you're learning to draw or learning to type. You can train the muscle memory of this organ here, even though it's not a muscle. Okay? So, if the hippocampus go down, we lose our memory, all that kind of stuff. We can even have issues go down in the insular cortex. You know, has anyone ever been so freaked out, so pumped up on their adrenaline and things like that, that all of a sudden your other senses start to go, you're not hearing things correctly? This is why people who tend to have a lot of anger management issues, or issues with bullying, as in being bullied, or being the bully, are, very poor listeners. Okay, people who are chronically at that stage, that 7, 8, 9, 10 stage are not the best active listeners. That's because, we're losing our capacity to relate to our senses when the amygdala is chronically overstimulated. Now, where does mindfulness come in? Well, with mindfulness, we're actually working with the insular cortex. Okay? We are actually, scientifically, changing our focus. We're taking the focus away from the stimulation of the amygdala, okay? And we are actually activating the insular cortex, which means this is going to make things go in another direction in the brain, okay? Because we have to analyze things, and our brain is going to be focusing on analyzing its senses. The amygdala goes down, so it's not overreacting to the stress, and we're training our brain to kind of go back into this analytical portion here. And analytics is good. Remember, it's a holistic world. We want to have holism, which means we can't just abandon one to the other. Go back to the insular cortex, where you're taking your mind and you're going into your senses. Mindfulness is all about going into your senses. Focus on your feet on the floor, focus on your breath, focus on a smell in the room, if somebody's burning incense, or maybe a special kind of cologne, maybe somebody, has something that you can focus your vision on, like a painting, or a really cool, lamp or statue in the room or something like that. Putting all of your attention there, to the exclusivity of all else, will actually change how your brain is secreting chemicals, is actually putting out chemicals. And people have already seen that, in children and in adults, it brings down that cortisol, it brings down that adrenaline, and all of a sudden that hyperactivity with the stress goes away. And suddenly the brain, again, is retrained, and we get our prefrontal cortex back, which is already good enough, but also at the same time, with enough practice, again, you have to train muscle memory. It's kind of like working out. You're not going to get giant biceps by lifting weights for one day and then calling it quits. What's going to happen is that we're going to get the brain to release less of that stress hormone. There's a difference, and that is the difference between people who have, they go into the freak out place, or they go into the place where, they can handle it, they can stay calm, they can think objectively. Okay, so we have objective thinking up here. So one person might feel like they think you said something about them on Facebook and then react like somebody ran over their dog, but another person is not. That's what's going on there.